Maybe, Dave, I'll start. Back in the sort of the slide 127, 128, 129 area, you were talking about study selection and the need to rely on expert judgment as you consider the options. I think it's perhaps slide 129 that is most relevant. And my question is really pretty simple in terms of how you would be as transparent as possible and document what went into decision-making around choice of a particular study in the face of relying on expert judgment, which you justify. But I guess my next question then is, how would you describe the process that leads to picking this or that?
So we have a series of questions here in terms of standard considerations. And when you're very first starting into the process, there may be some cases where in the beginning you have a sense, for example, if there's an incredibly rich human epidemiology data set, you might say, given the state of the science, we're going to focus on the epi data set. But it's probably not uncommon that at that point you really don't know which studies are going to rise to the top and which studies are going to need analysis. So part of an assessment then, and this could be different points along the way, you could adopt the protocol or amend the protocol, but ethylene oxide would be a good example where there was a fairly extensive description in the draft assessment of the reason that we selected a particular epidemiology study, and the reason, in fact, in that case, we didn't do a meta-analysis. We didn't try to combine several epidemiology studies. In that case, it was a point in public comment, it was a point in peer review. So not only did the final assessment go into that, but there was a response to the peer review comments that went further into depth as to what the strengths and weaknesses were of the available epidemiology studies and why we made the selection we did. So I don't know if that there's a formula for doing that, but an expectation that we will do that and lay that out.
Just one follow-up. I mean, it seems like there's, an array of possibilities in terms of the kinds of data available. I mean, you could go from rich epidemiology to minimal epidemiology to poor epidemiology to bio. I mean, if you start putting the cases together, I guess the question is, as you're thinking about this, are you thinking about systematizing the justification?
I think at this point it's sort of, in a sense, it's systematizing the questions one has to answer. I don't know that we've, at this point, tried to have a template for exactly how you would lay that out. But if you look at that slide, to the extent that there's a fairly standard list of questions, and in some cases you can, along the way, and part of your evidence, you're judging the quality of studies is a standard set of questions. Is the exposure well characterized? Is it characterized not just in terms of exposed, unexposed, but can you quantify it? Is it of a duration that matches what you're trying to do? So I think to the extent that we have a structured set of questions, that can lend itself to a structured way of laying that out.
Thanks. We'll go around the table. George.
Thanks. I have one question for David and two for Jason. So I guess I'll start with Jason. My two questions are, basically in terms of the analog-based assessment. I often describe that as essentially a hypothesis generation that requires some data that I think can, easily be generated by, say, the computational tox center's approaches. Is there some sort of formal agreement such that that data can be requested and generated to support your analog selections? And then the second one is more around, I think you've gotten to a place where your tools might be useful for providing advice in real time to the agency in a crisis, and I'm thinking particularly about Elk River, where we didn't know a lot about methylcyclohexane methanol. And I know that some tools that we developed got used, and it looks like you are developing tools, but it's never been kind of a remit of the IRIS program to provide that real-time information. How close do you feel like you are to being able to give that kind of service to the administrator?
Yeah, so on your first question, that's the idea for the RapidTox dashboard, is having that available to the translators, if you will, the human health assessors, and having that information surfaced. Basically, even the public could go in and use that dashboard once surfaced. The idea would be is that for any given chemical, and now this is for once that dashboard is surfaced, please note that it's thousands of chemicals, thousands and thousands of chemicals. Now, not all of them will have a full suite of the information in there in those modules, but the idea would be hopefully to have something there with, ideally empirical, sometimes estimated or modeled. The idea would be is for, at least in our approach thus far, the reason we call it expert-driven is because we have actually gone in and surveyed the available literature. Like we haven't used the dashboard yet for that purpose for human health assessment, but the future approach would be to use that RapidTox dashboard as the starting point to survey the available information for the analog space and the target of concern, and then to stage that information in the same way. Kind of the translational part of that is you have to have the experts sit there and evaluate across all of that, the structure, the phys-chem, the ADME, and the bioactivity information, because there's often things that a machine can't tell you, or a computer can't tell you, that moiety doesn't occur in that pH in the environment. So you can't have that analog be as an exposure source. So you have to have the experts sit there and look at that information. The source of that information right now, or to date, has been our survey of the available literature space, but in the future using that RapidTox dashboard. On your second point, the idea would, well, we actually, so we're here for IRIS, but again, I mentioned that another part of NCEA's mission is we actually serve customers who have emergency response type situations. We have a Superfund Technical Support Center, for instance, with a hotline. And so regions and other accepted users, like via the states or others, can call in and say, well, I've got a situation in West Virginia, and we need information like right now. The future idea would be to then go to RapidTox and type in that SMILES code or the CAS number, hit go, and see what you get back, and bring that information to bear once the experts have had at least a half a day, couple days to evaluate that info and make some at least partially confident conclusions. Yeah.
Can I just embellish on that 1 second before you move to David? So in the context of the portfolio that we were talking about yesterday, this is an example. Jason says this is an IRIS, but that's the whole point. We're moving in NCEA towards a portfolio of products that are not compartmentalized in brand names. We're infusing these processes across. And with the RapidTox that, George, you're particularly familiar with, the big turning point now is because of TSCA, there's a lot of interest in using RapidTox for various stages of prioritization, pre-prioritization, and other things. And it's at that point that it became evident that without having expert risk assessors at the table, the data from RapidTox could quickly devolve into misuse. So there's Reader Sams from NCEA who's on detail to RUSTI, to NCCT, and now Jason as a collaborator and a leader on the project, is to turn the dashboard around and bring to it a risk assessment perspective. We've had, on even the recent sort of Mercaptan question, we went to the dashboard and we tried to use it. There was a lot of information in it, but it turned out there was a lot of other information that was on. So we're using it to ground truth the information from the dashboard and reciprocally the data that we use. So these are very recent. I mean, that's these changes, but they contribute to this portfolio concept, because there's also a lot of perception out there that down the road, why should Jason even do PPR TVs? You'll go into RapidTox and push a button and it'll give you the answer that it wants. maybe, we don't know, maybe down the road that will be possible. But it certainly is something that we're going to have to work towards, and that's the role that Jason's playing. We're also going to be using this in our evaluation of perfluorinated compounds. There's a lot of data-rich, data-poor chemicals that'll give us an opportunity to explore these tools as well.
And David, I think it's a nice progression to be providing the risk values, but the models are still based on some assumptions around linearity, and clearly we know about. And you guys are developing tools for understanding mechanisms that are nonlinear, saturation of metabolism, and kinetic processes, and things like that. We saw some examples of subpopulations that are qualitatively different, like GSST minus people that wouldn't be in some sort of normal distribution kind of thing. So what's the state of the art in terms of incorporating those kinds of real biological considerations in the risk values?
Yeah. I think there's a little bit of walking before we run, that we've got to get the conversation to being about risk and about probability. The IPCS approach, in a lot of ways, doesn't really try to deal with low-dose extrapolation, because it's sort of taking here's an effect at a given rate, at a given intensity, and then using information about variability to say, what's the variability in the population of people who will have that effect? It's not getting to okay, but suppose I'm interested in an effect that's only 1/100th of that. So it's dealing with incidence, but not dealing with the extrapolation issue in terms of magnitude. So it doesn't solve that problem. But it does at least get us into a language of talking more explicitly about what effect are we talking about, what probability are we talking about, what kind of coverage are we talking about. To the extent that you know that you have a subpopulation, often the agency would break those apart. So instead of giving a distribution for the whole general population that might be bimodal, if you know that, particularly if you can identify, here's the group of people that's acting very differently. In general, I think we'd rather break it apart and therefore do two distributions. Here's a distribution in much of the population, but there is a subpopulation, and here's what we can say about the subpopulation. But you're right, there's no way a generic kind of characterization of human variability can cover and capture and anticipate all the information that you might have in individual cases. Yeah.
Okay, Lauren.
Yeah, my questions overlap with George's, and I think that maybe you've answered a couple. So, related to what you were just talking about in the Silver Book, there were a series of diagnostic questions to really try to tease out whether or not we are talking about certain susceptible populations. And I'm wondering if that has become more part of the process in proceeding forward with the dose response.
Mostly I see us looking at sensitive populations and, in a sense, treating them as a specific population. Mm-hmm. We will look at what we know about the biology. I think we still have a ways to go in terms of relating biology to actual low-dose extrapolation issues. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure what more to say.
Okay, I guess related to that is this issue where you might have a general exposure in the population that might even be above a reference dose, that might be a common occurrence. And there could be an analysis that looks at the whole issue of background exposure and whether you have a case of additivity for non-cancer endpoint that might lead you into a more cancer type assessment where you're looking at incremental changes in risk rather than shooting for a threshold target. Mm-hmm. And so have you done work looking at that kind of development? Because I didn't quite see that in the presentation.
Right. Let me talk about one case I can think of and then see if anybody else in the panel wants to pick up on this. One of the issues we dealt with involves shifts in lung function and recognizing that your population has quite a distribution in terms of what their current lung function is. And it's therefore not so easy to say, here's a shift that's adverse, because it depends on where you are in the population. And I remember we discussed that issue in the Libby amphibole asbestos assessment. Let me see if anybody else in the panel has an example of thinking that through.
I think I saw on the poster Leonid's example. Mm-hmm.
Yes, in Libby assessment, we were interested in a question. In the Libby asbestos assessment, we were interested in a question: do pleural plaques influence the pulmonary function? I mean, obviously, in medicine, pleural plaques are considered a marker of exposure. People say, they don't mean anything, but other than marker. But when we looked at a bunch of studies, we found that actually we can, by meta-analysis, find that there is a small but significant decrease in both FVC and FEV1, both important measures of pulmonary function. And obviously, 3% decrease in particular person, no medical doctor would say that this is, adverse or anything. But when we consider population, and there is clear definition of adversity for the decrease in pulmonary function, be it 80% or derived different way. When you look at the population of people and shift this population, you obviously increase dramatically the tail, which is below the adversity level. It's similar to example with lead and IQ, the similar type of argument. But it's an important, I think, to recognize that what might not necessarily be adverse in a person might have adversarial impact in a population.
Yeah, thank you. So it's kind of a different descriptor of risk than we're typically used to seeing. And I guess my final question is around the probabilistic descriptor and the extent to which it might be something that you might prefer to give for different risk contexts where a risk manager might need and be able to use that description, but potentially might not be as useful for someone that's looking for more screening value for prioritization or something, and whether how you will build that into your approach to coming up with different portfolios.
Right. I don't think we're talking about getting rid of the RFD, the RFC. They've served us very well across complex and thin databases, and people are very comfortable with that. It looks like it may not be very hard to do the calculations that are involved in the IPCS. It may take some judgments, though, that we're not quite used to of looking hard at the endpoints and thinking about them. I don't think we know yet where it's going to be useful, and part of the exercise is working with risk managers to see where are they comfortable with this, are they comfortable with it. You mentioned one case, which is, you can have situations where a population is exposed above a reference value, and it may be in a situation you can't change immediately. So if it's in water, you may be able to bring in bottled water immediately. If it's indoor air pollution in a school, you may not be able to shut down the school instantly. And it may be important to a risk manager to be able to communicate to the community, what can we tell you about an exposure that's 10 times the reference concentration? So that's one context. I think often I think it may not be very useful to people if it just becomes complication and makes the conversations difficult. But I think it will give us a more formal structure in which we can then bring in also more sophisticated dose response and mathematical issues, because we're actually talking about risk at that point.
Alan and I are working on the arsenic assessment, and there are situations with respect to arsenic where large populations, mostly outside of the U.S., are exposed to very high levels of arsenic. And so if we were to try to take some of those popular studies that are done in those large populations and just use those individual studies, we would be extrapolating quite far. But Bayesian meta-regression type tools can help us to combine studies that include studies in lower exposed populations, U.S., Italy, and do the type of more similar to a cancer slope factor type analysis for those effects like cardiovascular effects in addition to the cancer effects, which there are more studies for. But I think that we are looking at that possibility in addition to the IPCS type approach.
Okay, done. Do you have anything else, Lauren? Or are you done? Dave?
So these are follow-up questions from both John and Lauren. So how do you plan on documenting, to increase transparency, the suite of choices that you have with respect to quantitative analyses that you can do for dose response? Because I think as you're developing this large toolbox, you run the risk of eventually having the public believe that you may have been cherry-picking analyses. And so to what extent do you anticipate, say, protocol development for this type of step, having those undergo public review? Do you see kind of a traditional suite of analyses, like deriving RFCs and then showing complementary ones? Is this more exploratory within different assessments? Can you just give us a roadmap as to how you think you're going to actually apply this suite of tools you're developing?
Yeah. So, when the data breaks out into epidemiology and animal data being evaluated, so for the animal data with benchmark dose software, we have a fairly standard set of models we run against it. We actually think that model averaging helps simplify that problem, because instead of having to pick, do I use this model, do I use that model, you can look at an output that reflects all of the models with weights based on how well they fit the data. So in that sense, if we get comfortable with this, I think it may actually reduce the sense that we're picking winners and losers, because we're letting the data inform us in terms of the weight that we put on different models. In terms of epidemiology, there's still a judgment in terms of there's still some work involved in doing meta-analysis and exploring the various sensitivity analyses you'd want to do. If you have one very large, very well-conducted study as in a number of weaker ones, often you can get the benefit of that picture by the kinds of graphical analyses that were laid out yesterday. But if it's fairly easy to do meta-analysis, if the endpoints are fairly common, if it's not hard to get the data that you need to do in a meta-analysis, much as with my discussion just a minute ago about model averaging, it becomes a method to actually reduce how much you're cherry-picking, or the perception that you're cherry-picking, because you're putting all the data together and using it. So there are a range of tools being developed, but I think in some ways it reduces the perception of having to pick winners and losers, to the extent that things like meta-analysis or model averaging allow you to say, well, we gave weight to all of these things as dictated by the information in front of us. Does that answer your question?
If I can add to David's point, I mean, it's important to recognize that in epidemiology, we often don't have access to the original data, to the individual data for the studies, I mean. And most of the times we just have results modeled by other people. I mean, we don't have data to model. So in epidemiology, we're often limited by what the original authors do. And it's important to recognize that in epidemiology, there is no tradition of fitting 10 different models to the data like it's done in animal studies. So there would be a single dose response model and maybe some sensitivity analysis. But what is presented in the epidemiological data doesn't allow us to analyze it. So we will be transparent how we select which of the epidemiological studies, but it's hard to do many things when you only have one number.
I mean, I would say though that if it were really critical, you could go back to original data and do a pooled analysis. I mean, the one critical example of that would be, for example, the analysis done at BR6, where we gather together all the uranium underground miner data sets. So they're really critical to explore issues in epidemiology. You could, albeit with a great deal of work, access the original data sets. So, and that in a way would be the ultimate way to explore epi data.
Right, and we have sometimes gotten the individual data and done modeling. Actually, Libby was an example where we got individual data. You sometimes need the researcher's permission, and they don't want to. Their privacy issues.
Wasn't easy.
Right, yeah. So there are a lot of things. So that's part of, again, problem scoping and formulation. How good is the answer we have without doing that? What's the need? What's the precision? What's the timing? Is it worth doing that?
Richard.
Yeah, let me just follow up on Dave's point. I think that the idea of moving away from things like uncertainty factors to model averaging to what you're doing is really in the right direction. I think it's going to be much easier to make a case that we're taking into account all the evidence and not cherry picking, et cetera. But you still have to pick a set of studies to model average over, and you still have to determine the weights that you're going to put on each of the models in that space of models. So I think what Dave was getting at is, what is the plan for being transparent about that? How are you going to make the decisions about which weights to put on which models? Is there going to be public comment on that sort of a thing, et cetera, et cetera? Because I think that, you could argue that you were doing model averaging before with one model, right? Or one or two models. And now you're going to a space of models, but you still have to put a weight over them, and that's still going to be, I think, something where you have to make transparent, and how are we going to do that?
So Alan may be a better person to talk about that. I think the weights are coming out of, though, how well they fit the data. So there's still a selection of what models you're going to look at. But I don't think it's a priori putting weights on the models then. But Alan, you want to?
That's correct. Right now, with the methods that have been published for model averaging that have been used by other agencies, and the methods we're developing, the Bayesian model averaging approaches, we are not putting weights ourselves on the models, because the presumption is, the reason why we're doing model averaging is we don't know if the true best model is in the suite of models we are applying. And we allow the data to dictate the actual weight. So in frequentist approach, it's the AIC or the BIC that's used as the weight. In a Bayesian approach, it's the marginal density of the data and the posterior distributions of the models. So you can expand beyond that and put a priori weights on models if you think that your mode of action is linear or nonlinear or maybe threshold, but we're not at that point yet. The methods that we will be having peer reviewed, the data drive the weights. Yep.
Yeah, okay. Ilyang, I was surprised that you had passed before, so I'm reassured that you.
Well, these are great questions. I think my questions somewhat relate to this. Well, first of all, it was great to see many posters yesterday that demonstrate EPA's efforts in developing a suite of tools. So what I'm wondering was, I've seen meta-regression, I've seen meta-analysis, I've seen Bayesian model averaging. And these are all to some extent to address the concern that doesn't matter what you do, there's always uncertainty associated with the study you pick, the endpoint you choose, the toxicity value you derive. So I wonder if the panel could articulate that given all these activities, what is the overarching goal in terms of what type of tool set the agency wants to have in its toolbox so that at the end of the day, when you do another IRIS review, you know exactly what tool to apply to address the question you have. Right now, it seems to me, individual group is doing interesting here and there to address a specific issue. Like, for example, model averaging, essentially you're talking about the same endpoint and a different model, but then you can expand to integrate over different studies. So can you articulate sort of concerted efforts where we know the tools we need and rather than address study specific issues every time? I hope my question was sort of.
I think with respect to model averaging, that's going to become our preferred approach. Right now, we're focusing on dichotomous model averaging, but we are conducting research into best methods for addressing model uncertainty with continuous data. And I think the intent is eventually we'll move towards, like right now, I think it's universally accepted that if you can do BMD modeling, you're going to do that over the no-AL, low-AL. So there's not maybe a differential approach across assessments there. And eventually, hopefully, we will get to that point with model averaging and one data set at a time. I think we've also found that pre-existing software tools such as Metaphor and R are very easy to use off the shelf with respect to meta-analysis. And we presented a couple of case studies where that tool was applied to animal data and human data. So I think with respect to that, we'll move to using that tool. I know Chris is interested in using Metaphor in Hawk if we can. The question there is Metaphor is one of the best R libraries I've ever used. It's very well documented, but it's also quite powerful, and you can slice and dice your data in multiple ways and analyze them in multiple ways. So the trick there is how do we put a structured framework around that in determining what is the most likely approach that we're going to use across multiple assessments. But I think we can answer that, and eventually we will either across assessments either use Metaphor natively in R or hopefully develop a Hawk module where people they've already extracted all their data and it's just a push button analysis. Okay, I want to do a meta-analysis on data set 1, data set 2, data set 3.
Yeah. And also, very quickly, to answer your question about endpoint-specific type analyses, how would we provide guidance that might be endpoint-specific? Right now, for the model averaging effort that we have going, it's a Bayesian model averaging approach, and the priors that we're setting for that Bayesian model averaging approach were initially focusing on a generic set of priors. One of the concerns is that we don't want to, we want to be reproducible in our results, so we don't necessarily want one person to use one set of priors and one person to use another set of priors, so that obviously that's a concern. When we go, David had mentioned that we're doing a peer review, and when we go to peer review, we're going to ask the peer reviewers, well, is this set of priors appropriate? If there be separate sets of priors for endpoint categories, other endpoint categories? We may branch off that direction at some point, but we're just initially exploring this area right now.
So a follow-up question on that is this model averaging approach going to be expanded so that you can averaging over not only models for the same endpoint, but over similar endpoints, then over different studies? Is that the overall goal, or that your model averaging is restricted to only averaging over different models for the same endpoint and from the same study?
Right now, that's the goal, but there's nothing to prevent us from expanding the approach to be able to do a meta-analytic model averaging approach that you're suggesting. So, but right now, with respect to the peer review that we'll be seeking in 2018, it is data set specific. But it's easily expandable after that point to do a meta-analysis.
Okay, so that's the goal of the agency, to develop a sort of a tool that could allow you to integrate over study, because that's exactly the question earlier. That is, by looking at multiple studies, you don't have to cherry pick one study, but that requires a tool to integrate or let's say averaging over studies, over endpoints.
I think the goal is to expand our meta-analytic capacity broadly, but the goal with model averaging, the Bayesian model averaging that we have right now, the immediate goal is to get that peer reviewed and get that into use for individual data sets. And once we reach that goal, then we'll expand to meta-analysis with that tool.
Is it your view that doesn't matter whether you call the model averaging Bayesian or meta-regression or the EU approach, the purpose is the same?
The purpose and goal is to expand our ability to integrate across data streams. So, I mean, whether it's frequentist or just a straight meta-analysis or meta-regression using the metaphor package, which is not Bayesian, or development of Bayesian approaches, I think the core goal is the same, to be able to integrate data more efficiently within and across data streams.
Let me jump in with one thing though. So when you're talking about across endpoints, if we have two endpoints that are not biologically related at all, I'm not sure there's any benefit from integrating across the endpoints. If we had something where the same mechanism can lead to several different phenotypes, well, yes, then at that point you might find there's some advantage. The other thing is, if this all gets so it's incredibly easy, then yes, one might do it all the time. But to the extent there's still judgment and work involved, there's still kind of a benefit cost thinking about, is the complexity of using results from 15 studies in fact going to improve my answer? There may be cases where looking at the evidence you can say, you know, this study is going to be the one that's weighted the most at the end, and I can get a lot of what I need in a timely manner by using this study.
Totally agree. This relates to the last question I have. That is, I thought that when the committee or the NRC reports repeatedly say we use systematic review, I thought systematic review is a tool to help us to inform us for study and model integration. But I think that link has not been emphasized enough in the presentation right now. That's my sense. So in other words, in terms of when we could use model averaging approach to integrate across endpoints, that could be well informed by systematic review, because then we know what type of endpoints are plausible to be integrated, what type of studies could be combined. So right. That's my comment.
So we're certainly using systematic review before we get to the point of saying which endpoints are we going to carry forward, right? If what you're saying is in the course of systematic review, information as to whether this is part of a syndrome, whether this has a common mode of action, I think you're right, could be part of, and we have one example of a chemical that we've been looking at where it's clear that there are multiple endpoints that seem to be part of a syndrome and it may be worth pooling. So that's true. That's part of particularly the mechanistic information could help inform, is this a case where you have endpoints that are, information on one endpoint is informing you about a syndrome and a spectrum of endpoints?
Even for studies that are supported biologically, I mean, when you look at the study quality, systematic review definitely could inform you over what threshold of quality the study could be included in meta-analysis, for example. But I thought if we could emphasize that, it could strengthen your process, because you do have a system based on which you select your study data sets for model, whether it's model averaging or integration to overcome uncertainty, all these.
Chris, you can use the podium.
Sorry. I just wanted to add that I think when we think about systematic review in the context of this, so one is systematic reviews to enhance the transparency. And what we've tried to sort of show you, especially yesterday, is where within the field of systematic review, there are sort of best practices. And we wanted to sort of show you how we're implementing those best practices. But now I think we're moving into an area where there's not best practices in the context of systematic review. And then here, the idea that I think has been highlighted is just being transparent, whether you can do that in the context of the protocol or the actual draft assessment about the options that were considered and then the decisions made.
Yeah, so this actually, in a sense, goes back to the question both I asked and Dave asked originally. I think Ilian perhaps articulated in a useful way, and looking for the connection between what comes before and then, how, in fact, the systematic review process becomes a framework, I think, for what is done on the actual dose response.
I'm personally advocating more than transparency, because systematic review can be more useful than just being transparent, which is very important.
I just wanted to add one point, and that is when we're talking about meta-analysis, we're combining studies in order to increase the power of the analysis or the reliability of the analysis. And so we might accept a lesser quality study in a meta-analysis than if we were just using that study as the focal point of our risk assessment or regulatory analysis. So because of the fact that we are combining data, right?
If a study is so poor that's going to be removed from the radar screen based upon systematic review, I would hope that in your model averaging process, that study is not going to be included.
Yeah, and I think we maybe didn't make that clear. I tend to view this as you have a funnel approach, where you start with everything you can get with your search terms, what's relevant, what do you exclude, what are the quality studies, and typically, you're not then expanding the funnel out again for dose response. You're looking at those studies that you've decided are of adequate quality and relevance, and then saying, now, which of these actually get me quantitative information on exposure and results that I can use? So those initial screens are sort of taken for granted, and maybe we didn't make that clear, that the systematic review, as you filter down to what are the best studies, you're typically then saying, of those, which ones give me good dose response? Because some will fall out because they're not giving you very good exposure characterization, for example.
But I think what he was pointing to was, in the earlier stages of the systematic review, you're going to do things like evaluate the quality of the studies. If you could explicitly connect that to weight, the things you're going to use for the quantitative analysis, that makes the whole thing transparent and actually justified in a way that I think is helpful.
Can I go back to the different endpoints? I mean, in most cases, the endpoints would be ordered by severity, right? So basically integrating over different endpoints which are different, I mean, coming back to asbestos, maybe you wouldn't want to integrate over pleural plaques and asbestosis. I mean, that just doesn't make sense. So more often than not, there would be this hierarchy. So probably there would be separate cases where you could, and it makes sense to integrate over endpoints, but that rather be exclusion to the rule, I think.
And I just wanted to add a couple of things. I think that some of these questions are maybe before the dose response section that might be being covered as well. They're more qualitative considerations. One had to do with susceptibility. We actually do have a section during our hazard identification at the end of when we're characterizing the evidence integration of susceptibility, and it asks those questions about, are there specific genotypes that are sensitive or sexes? And that carries straight forward into the dose response when we're looking for those populations of interest to be included in the analysis or have risk estimates for those populations to be preferred for dose response now. So that's explicitly links forward and backwards. Secondly is study selection for dose response. And maybe we didn't cover it explicitly enough, but at the top here it says medium or high confidence studies are preferred. That's from those study evaluations in section 1, right, when we've already evaluated the individual studies for risk of bias, sensitivity, and reporting quality. We haven't explicitly linked that to weighting. I think that's a great idea. But that's an explicit step in our selection of studies. And then for those studies that are medium or high confidence, for example, when we have them, we then ask these other questions of those, say, 5 studies and have a table documenting the characteristics of those studies that don't meet these specific questions and why they weren't advanced for quantification. And then of those that did meet these criteria, we would then move, say, 2 or 3 studies forward and provide an estimate and then describe the strengths and the limitations of those estimates of those 3 studies and why we preferred 1 or 2 of those estimates over the others. So maybe just to add a little bit of clarification from a systematic review process, how it feeds forward as opposed to the specific quantification. So,
Lauren?
Just a final thing on an additional dimension of meta-analysis for animal studies, and wondering about your thinking of it. In the future, we'll probably have panels of genetically similar animals. Right now what we have more frequently, so we have these panels of, within the panel you have homogeneity, but you have multiple and they've been studied and you have different results depending on the genetics. But what we often have are a series of studies which are heterogeneous, which might actually, because they're heterogeneous, they're telling you something different about susceptibility. And in terms of meta-analysis, I'm wondering what your thoughts are with respect to coming up with estimates across studies, given that the heterogeneity might in fact be telling you something about susceptibility.
I think in particular instances, if we have the biological information to say this species is reacting differently than this species, and you face the question, well, which is a better predictor of humans? So we've thought about it at that point, and sometimes they're mode of action arguments, sometimes they're PBPK arguments. But I think you're right that often it's still sort of saying which is the better model, right? In terms of reflecting that ultimately you want to realize that there's human variability, I don't know that we're there yet in terms of knowing how to look at, say, even within one species, if you've got the deliberately mixed up sort of genetic panel of animals. I don't know that we're at the point right now of knowing how to use that, how well that captures human variability. I would have some hesitancy of just taking rats and mice and putting them both together, but if you're taking various genetic strains of mice, capturing that variability, I'm not sure we're there yet in terms of knowing how well that predicts human variability and just how to use that.
Okay, I think last chance. I think we're done. Ilyang, are you?
I think the approach is definitely attractive that you folks are taking, but designing weights, whether you call it weights or prior probability or mixing probability, I think Laura made good comments. I mean, in designing the weights, quote unquote, biological information is very important. Study quality is very important. And there are many other factors we could have considered. That's a pretty challenging. So I wonder, if we have a short-term, long-term plan move forward in terms of having sort of a mature tool that is defensible.
Well, just to elaborate 1 second, I think if you gave us sort of a few time points, I mean, X months, Y months, whatever it is in terms of when you see these different tools come into completion.
Right, so the tool that comes the closest that the agency has developed to being able to answer a question like what you're talking about there is the categorical regression tool, where we can define severity categories to responses and combine data from different studies, different rat, mice, et cetera, and you can analyze in CatReg whether the slope of the dose response is different from rats versus mice, is different for the different endpoints that you might put into that CatReg analysis. But the difficulty there is in defining those categories, and there's a similar difficulty, I would think, in putting weights on the studies that go into that analysis. That's a box that we haven't gotten into yet.
Okay, I think we've had a great discussion. I mean, maybe just in closing, so model development, tool development can go on forever, of course, and it should. I mean, there'll always be new things. But in terms of just give us a few sort of time landmarks when you expect some of these tools to come to the point where you say there's standards, we're going to use them, and they're sort of out there.
Right. The epidemiologists I've talked to in the group feel like they, in many cases, have the tools they need in something like Metaphor for at least doing fairly standard meta-analysis. Model averaging, which the one we're looking at starts with a Bayesian approach, we are hoping to get out for peer review in this calendar year, right? What else? I think the Bayesian networks is something that it's more exploratory at the moment, that we're not sure exactly where and how you would best use that. Doing the calculations and the application of the IPCS approach, I think we can do very quickly. I think the issue there is it's a whole different way of describing what you have, and so there's some work to do in terms of how to communicate that and how to make people comfortable with that. But I think we'll start using that this year and providing some results from that this year.
Thank you. I think we've had a full...
If I could add, not only are we hoping, I mean, we will get the Bayesian model averaging into peer review this year. We're expecting to release a new version of BMDS by the end of the fiscal year that actually has that capacity available for modelers. And CatReg is available currently.
Right, and will be, because we don't have guidance at this point, it'll be put in BMDS 3.0 as an alternate approach. So it won't be baby steps here. We don't have agency guidance yet, but we're baby steps going in there.
All right, good. I think we are done with this discussion.